Nothing Ever Happens on 90th Street by Roni Schotter, illustrated by Kristen Brooker. Eva unwrapped the cinnamon Danish, opened her notebook, and stared helplessly at the wide, white pages. Write about what you know, her teacher, Mrs. DeMarco, had told her. So Eva sat high on the stoop and looked out over 90th Street, waiting for something to happen. A horn honked, a radio rapped, a kid cried, the usual. Nothing ever happens on 90th Street, Eva scribbled in her notebook. A few doors down, Mr. Chang was arranging fish fillets in his newly opened seafood emporium. No one was buying, and his shop looked as empty and ignored as the tiny boarded-up store next door to it. He nodded to a woman passing by and called hello to Eva. Out the door of Eva's building came Mr. Sims, the actor, carrying his enormous cat, Oliver. Mr. Sims was on hiatus again, which meant out of work, in between shows, and so every day, dressed in his finest, he embarked on a daily promenade with Oliver under his arm. Writing, he asked. Trying to, Eva answered, but nothing ever happens on 90th Street. You are mistaken, my dear, Mr. Sims says. The whole world's a stage, even 90th Street, and each of us play a part. Watch the stage, observe the players carefully, and don't neglect the details, he said, stroking Oliver. Follow an old actor's advice, and you will find you have plenty to write about. Thanks, Eva said, and fast as she could, using as many details as she could recall, Eva described Mr. Sims in her notebook. His felt fedora hat, his curly gray hair, his shiny button shoes. When she looked up, he was halfway down the street, and Mr. Morley, the moose maker, was at his window. Just as he did every day, Mr. Morley set his chocolate pot and coffee urn out on his ledge with a sign. Mr. Morley dreamed of having a catering business where the fanciest people demanded his dessert. But the trouble was, Mr. Morley's moose was missing something. No matter how he tried, his moose never had much taste, and Mr. Morley never had many customers. Writing, he asked. Eva answered, chewing on her pencil. Trying to find the poetry in your pudding, Mr. Morley said softly. There's always a new way with old words. You're right, Eva said, wishing Mr. Morley one day find the poetry in his pudding. Taking his advice, she tried to think of a new way to describe the look of Mr. Morley's moose. Smooth and dark as midnight. Or maybe more like mink. Yes, that was it, Eva thought, writing in her notebook. The door to the building slammed, and a gust of wind sent dead leaves soaring and dripping like crazy kites. Alexis Leora nodded to Eva and stepped gracefully down the steps to do her warm exercise. Alexis was a dancer. When she wanted to, she could hold an extremely long leg straight up against her ear like a one-legged woman with 3 arms. But she couldn't smile. Eva decided it was because Alexis Leora was lonely. Writing, Alexis Leora asked Eva. Yes, Eva answered. Alexis Leora did 6 deep knee bends and then sighed. Stretch, she said sadly. Use your imagination. If your story doesn't go the way you want it to, you can always stretch the truth. You can ask, what if, and make up a better story. You're right, Eva said, thinking, what if? What if Alexis Leora met someone? Would she smile then? What would that look like? Eva closed her eyes to try to picture it, but all she could picture was soup, Spanish soup, rich and brown and so spicy it seemed as if she could actually smell it. She could. When Eva opened up her eyes, Mrs. Martinez was standing beside her. She nodded to Alexis Leora as she handed Eva a bowl of soup. Have, son, she said. Writers need soup. What's your story about? Nothing much, Eva said. Nothing ever happens on 90th Street. Add a little action, Mrs. Martinez says, like soup. A little this, a little that, and don't forget the spice. Mix it, stir it, make something happen. Surprise yourself. She nodded again to Alexis Leora and went inside. Eva put down her pencil and tasted Mrs. Martinez's wonderful, surprising soup. She thought about her story. It wasn't wonderful. It wasn't surprising. But what should she do? What could she do? Nothing ever happened on 90th Street. How could she possibly add a little action and make something happen? Eva had no ideas. She was stuck. Then Mrs. Fridman from up the block came wheeling baby Joshua on his shoulder. He was holding a bright red ball in two tiny fat hands. Bird, he called out to a pigeon hunting for something to eat. Bird, hungry. Pigeon, Mrs. Fridman told him. Eva sighed and looked down at her half-eaten Danish, then at her notebook. She looked at baby Joshua, then at the pigeon. She remembered Alexis Leora's word of advice. What if? Eva thought. Suddenly she had an idea. What if she stood up, broke her Danish into dozens of tiny pieces, and scattered them wide and wild on the street? What would happen? Eva laughed to think about it. From lampposts and ledges, dozens of pigeons swooped down to dine on Danish. Eva eagerly picked up her pencils and began to write again. Bird, baby Joshua called out, pointing. More bird, he cried, panting. The bright red ball dropped out of his tiny fat hands and bounced onto the sidewalk. Bye, bye, ball, baby Joshua screamed. The ball rolled off the curb into the street and straight into the path of a pizza delivery man on his bicycle. Everyone gasped in horror. Alexis Leora paused in mid-pile and leaped to the rescue. She got there just as the pizza delivery man landed, right side up at her feet. Alexis Leora looked down at the pizza man and he looked up at her. And then something almost unimaginable happened. Alexis Leora smiled. Are you all right? She asked shyly. Her smile was sweet and bright. Her teeth were straight and white. It was the first time Eva or anyone on 90th Street had seen them. Yes, said the pizza man, smiling up at her. It was love at first sight. Pepperoni and pizzas rained down on the happy couple. The pizza man pulled the pepper out of his hair as his horns began to honk. Eva added this to her notebook and wondered what could possibly happen next. A long white limousine was honking its horn loudest of all. The limo driver rolled down his window. What you want to block traffic for, he called out. The back door of the limo opened and out stepped a woman in sunglasses, wearing a turban and a coat the color of a taxi. There seems to be a problem, Henry, she said in a fake English accent. There's some sort of accident here, perhaps. It's Sandra, someone suddenly screamed into her. Sandra! Can I have your autograph, Mrs. Martinez called out. Saunderson, Mrs. Morley blushed. Was Eva dreaming? There, in the middle of 90th Street, longer than life, stood Sandra Saunderson, star of stage, screen, and the sensational soap opera One World to Live In. Darlings, what happened here? I'm sure Larry, she called out suddenly and stretched her arm toward Mr. Sims, who had just returned from his promenade. It's been ages since we saw each other. Mr. Sims' cat, about to be crushed in an extravagant embrace, leaped out of Mr. Sims' arms to chase after baby Joshua's ball. Olivia, Mr. Sims calls out, come back. Everyone raced on the street after the ball, but it was the limo driver who, in the right place at the right time, leaned into the gutter and picked it up. With a flick of the wrist, he tossed the ball to Mrs. Fridman, who presented it to a drooling but grateful baby Joshua. How's that for a throw? The limo driver proudly asked the crowd. No one, not even baby Joshua, had a chance to answer. Olivier, frightened by so many people, raced past Eva, scrambled onto Mr. Morley's ledge, where he knocked over his coffee urn, spilling all the coffee into his moose pot. Ruined, Mr. Morley cried, wringing his hands. At that, Olivier bounded to the top of a ginkgo tree, where he swayed dangerously like a heavy white balloon. Now he'll never come down, Mr. Simmons lamented. He's terribly stubborn. There, Larry. Sandra Sanderson comforted him. I'm sure someone on 90th Street will have a solution. Eva tried to imagine who that could possibly be. I have one, she heard Mr. Chang call out. Generously, he offered trout, fresh from the store, to Olivier. High up in the tree, Olivier barely blinked. Raw trout, Mr. Simmons smiled. My regrets, Mr. Chang. He won't eat it. He's a gourmet cat. I'm afraid I spoiled him. Whatever will I do? What if? Eva asked herself a second time that day, and suddenly she had another idea. A truly great one. She whispered it to Mr. Morley, Mrs. Martinez, and Mr. Chang. Brilliant, Mr. Morley exclaimed, and with that he, Mrs. Martinez, and Mr. Chang, still clutching his trout, vanished in the building. Eva righted Mr. Morley's coffee urn and stuck her finger into his ruined moose, and then into her mouth to determine the degree of damage. Mocha, she called out in surprise. Mr. Morley's is mocha now, and... She paused, trying to find the perfect word. Magnificent, she announced to the assembling throng, and giving the pot a stir, she dished out samples to all assemble. Delicious, Alexis Leora said, spooning some into the pizza man's mouth. Poetry, Sandra Sanderson pronounced. Olivia took one deep sniff and bolted down the tree to dine. Everyone on 90th Street sampled each course, and everyone on 90th Street sighed with delight. Superb, fantastico, yum. Eva smiled and glanced up from her notebook. For the third time that day, she asked herself, what if? Mr. Chang, she began, you and Mr. Morley and Mrs. Martinez are such good cooks. The boarded-up store next to your seafood emporium, what if all of you used it for a restaurant? A restaurant? The three chefs looked at one another. What a wonderful idea, they said, shaking Eva's hand. Everyone on 90th Street could be our customers. You too, Sandra. Everyone but me, Mr. Sims said regretfully. Just now, I'm between jobs and a bit low on cash. No longer, Sandra called out. You'll be on my show. I'll arrange it. Mr. Sims kissed Sandra's hands and everyone cheered. What an amazing day, Mrs. Martinez said. Who would believe it? If only someone had written it all down. I did, Eva announced, and she opened up her notebook and began to read her story, the same story you're reading now, about how nothing ever happened on 90th Street. What a story, Sandra exclaimed, full of detail, dialogue, suspense, a bit of poetry, and of romance, even a happy ending. Why, you'd almost think some of it was made up. Eva smiled mysteriously. Thanks, she said proudly. But just wait. It'll be even better after I rewrite it. The end.